Hello, today I thought I'd look at a classic Rioja, and this is Campo Viejo. It is their Gran Reserva, and this is the 2016 vintage of that. So Campo Viejo, one of the largest Rioja producers, based in Logrono, so we're in northern Spain here. The company was founded in 1959 by three businessmen: Jose Otiguela, who evidently was the wine interest in the trio, Bernardo Beristan and Juan Alcorta. Evidently, Otiguela had grown up in El Villar de Arnedo before moving to San Sebastian in later life, and the brand name Campo Viejo, simply meaning old field, honours the local vineyards seen there in what was then Rioja Baja. So it's probably referencing a vineyard that would have been planted with garnacha, whose fruit would have gone to sort of make up blends, with Tempranillo coming from the Rioja Alta and the Rioja Alevesa. Now, Campo Viejo was part of a group called SAVIN, and that group's core business was to vinify, blend and bottle large volumes of cheap table wine, with the constituents coming from all over Spain and being sold both in bottle and in bulk within Spain and worldwide. Now, the wineries that comprised the SAVIN group were acquired by a larger group called Bodegas y Bibedas, and then in 2001 that group was acquired by the global wines and spirits group Allied Domecq. 4 years later, when Pernod Ricard made an acquisition of the wine assets of Allied Domecq, Campo Viejo came under their control and were part of Pernod Ricard winemakers for 20 years until last year, when the majority of the winemaking assets of Pernod Ricard were sold in a merger with Accolade wines to become Vinarchy. Now, as far as the brand is concerned, Campo Viejo's success stemmed from the fact that it was designed from the outset as a relatively inexpensive mass-market brand of Rioja, with this targeting coming at a time when supermarkets were actually quite a new distribution channel in Spain. Up until then, it's fair to say that most Riojas had been sold in restaurants. And actually, I suppose thanks to its popularity, Campo Viejo helped to define consumers' overall image of Rioja. As far as the brand was concerned, it was a range that started with a Crianza, so an oak-aged wine, that was complemented by a Reserva and a Gran Reserva. They did make an unaged red, but that was sold as a separate brand. And thus, this original range of Campo Viejo wines actually served to showcase the idea that Rioja was a barrel-aged style of wine. Unsurprisingly, the brand was one of the first Rioja brands to succeed internationally, and this helped it to grow to become one of the major players in the Rioja region, to the extent that today Campo Viejo is a top-selling brand with one of the largest wineries in Rioja and is distributed in over 70 countries worldwide. Now, in 2001, at about the same time as Bordegas y Bibedas was being taken over by Pernod Ricard, they opened a brand new, highly innovative and sustainable winery. The design featured massive underground cellars built into a hillside in Logrono, these providing massive amounts of underground temperature-controlled storage for aging the wines. And being built into the hillside gives stable temperature, reducing the need for temperature control and air conditioning. The design of the winery is entirely done to work by gravity feed, with the grapes coming in at the top of the winery and aging taking place on the lowest levels. Obviously, this approach minimises the use of pumps, but beside that, the entire facility takes its power from renewable energy. And Campo Viejo have gone on from that start to become leaders in the region in the field of sustainability. In 2011, Campo Viejo claimed that they were the first Spanish winery to be certified for their carbon footprint. And in 2012, they went on to achieve carbon neutral certification. Now, as I say, Campo Viejo are a large brand. They take fruit from over 500 growers. The information I have about the Gran Reserva says that the fruit for this is taken from vines that are over 35 years old. So that should help from the outset to give good concentrated fruit. They also make the point that fruit is sourced from across the three sub-regions, so Rioja Alta, Rioja Alevesa, and also Rioja Oriental, or what would previously have been known as Baja. Having said that, given the fact that the blend of this wine is predominantly Tempranillo, it's most likely that most of the fruit for the Gran Reserva comes from Rioja Alta and Rioja Alevesa. Once the bunches arrive at the winery, they're destemmed, they're crushed, and they're put by gravity into stainless steel tanks to ferment. Fermentation is regulated to 28 degrees Celsius, so not allowing the ferment to get too hot to extract harsh tannins or to allow off flavours to be created if fermentation gets too hot and the yeast shock themselves. The skins are allowed to macerate in the liquid for 20 days, and once the wine is pressed, it'll undergo malolactic conversion before being put into barrel. Now, Rioja Gran Reserva has to age for 5 years before release, and the notes on this wine tells us that this ages for 2 years in barrel and then subsequently for a further 3 years in bottle. The time spent in barrel is in a mixture of French and American oak. It's about 80% French oak and 20% American oak. And there's also an interesting distinction made in the notes I've got between French oak barrels and American oak casks. So my presumption from that is that the format of the American oak is actually a larger size. In that case, larger barrels will slightly tone down the vanilla contribution that you'd expect to get from American oak to the blend. Now, as far as the varieties are concerned, I'm told the blend is 85% Tempranillo, with the remaining 15% being made up of Graciano and Mauzuelo. Now, the notes I've seen for this vintage don't actually tell me what the breakdown of the Graciano and the Mauzuelo is. In previous vintages, that's normally been 10% of Graciano and 5% of Mauzuelo. So I'm not sure whether it's an oversight that they haven't put that information in there, or whether perhaps there is a change in the percentage for this particular vintage. So let's have a look at the wine and see what we make of it, shall we? In terms of the wine's colour, it's a medium intensity of what is quite a dark ruby red. But as I'm swirling it, you can see there is a sort of a slight browning, perhaps a brickish red hue to the wine. I'm swirling it. It's labelled as 13.5% alcohol, and it's quite readily forming some tears on the side of the glass there. And that's pointing to a reasonable amount of tannin in the wine, but that's only to be expected, really. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? At first, the aromas seem a little reticent to show themselves. There is a sort of a spicy, gingery, perhaps slightly coffee-ish note over the red fruit that's present. Once the red fruit starts to show itself, there's a rich, ripe red cherry note. There's almost sort of notes of dried cranberry. Perhaps a hint of red currant, and eventually some delicate, almost sort of flower petal notes. Coming back to it, the spicy notes I mentioned earlier perhaps have a little more dustiness, and are now showing a touch of cedar. Certainly there's plenty to find in the aromas, but you have to spend a little while looking for it. So let's have a taste. On the palate, there's a sort of a front of mouth richness with concentrated ripe fruit. It's that sort of ripe red cherry, as I say, dried cranberry, again that concentrated note. There is some quite good fresh acidity, and that's helping to lift those sort of perfumed flower petal notes there slightly. But at the same time, the dusty, slightly spicy, slightly cinnamon notes are also overlaying the fruit on the front palate. There's a little bit of interplay between the fine, drying tannic structure and the acidity that's just giving a mouth-watering sensation across the middle and the edges of my tongue. Interestingly, the wine is very much at the front of my mouth. There isn't a richness and a weight that's seen further back on the tongue. The alcohol at 13.5% is quite nicely balanced. It's not standing out particularly. The wine is quite rich, but it's really not much more than medium-bodied. There's a concentration to the fruit. Again, I'm thinking of dried cranberries, glacier cherry, and that's all nicely integrated with fine powdery tannins on the mid palate. There are slight chocolatey notes and a smooth hint of cocoa powder. The wine's good intensity is giving it quite a nice, long, structured finish, and there is just enough acidity that some of those delicate red fruits and flower petal perfumes are showing on the finish. As a Gran Reserva, the wine aged for 5 years prior to release, and so should be ready to drink at that stage. This has had a further 5 years aging, and I certainly wouldn't suggest that it needs any more time in bottle to drink really nicely. That having been said, the wine has concentration, it has freshness. I would have no worries about keeping this in the cellar for another 5 or 6 years, and it might just become that little bit smoother and those attractive perfumes might demonstrate themselves in a slightly more ethereal way. I took a look at the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for this wine, and it scores 89 out of 100. I think that's a fair score. I think myself I might possibly have been kinder and scored it 90 out of 100. If anything, I'm slightly surprised by the wine's slightly modern, clean fruit. I would have expected perhaps a slightly more oxidative character than this is giving from a wine that has spent 36 months in barrel. I don't think that's necessarily a fault. It makes it very attractive and it makes it drinkable. And it perhaps points to a slight change in style going on at Campo Viejo. I can remember reviewing the 2012 vintage of this and finding that a slightly more traditional style of Gran Reserva Rioja. Other than that, I'm delighted to find that this is such an approachable and attractive wine, whose fine tannins and attractive perfumes clearly demonstrate some good Tempranillo character. So thank you so much for joining me for this video. I do hope you've enjoyed watching it. If you have, could I ask you to press the like button? That would be very much appreciated. If you have any friends you think might like to watch it, I'd be very grateful if you'd pass it on to them. That would be a fantastic endorsement from. If you are watching these videos and you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, could I perhaps ask you to consider that? Growing the numbers of followers would really help me to develop the channel further. And if you have any comments or questions, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. Now, I will leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so that you can see if it's available near you and the price at which it's for sale. So once again, thank you so much for joining me. I do hope that maybe you'll manage to find some time in the near future and come and join me for another video tasting. Until then,